The salvo of coilgun shells smashes into the complex of bunkers on the opposite riverbank, sending a spray of charred dirt, sandbags, and timber flying into the air. A sloped bastion caves in, burying the rifle pits at its base. One leg of a watchtower is blasted away and the whole thing sways drunkenly before twisting and collapsing across the trenches, the flagpole on its roof somehow landing upright and leaving the enemy's blue and gold standard waving in the debris-laden breeze. The human artillerymen beside me let out a cheer and jump up and down, slapping each other's outstretched hands. The army of humans watching from beyond the battery all jump around and cheer, too, their yells loud even compared to a half-dozen high-explosive shells. And, so do the human gunners on the hillside across the river, and the army behind them. They all cheer and applaud. Even though they are, in fact, the enemy whose defenses are getting blasted into pieces the size of a poet's paycheck by the aforementioned coilguns. So, I cheer my lovely green head off right along with them, because things are exploding and stuff is burning and apparently the humans on this planet just generally approve of that sort of thing. My name is Salantha Rivalthina, and I'm the Felra who goes to the places nobody else wants to and learns about them the hard way so you can learn about them the easy way. That's my angle as an author, and that's why I'm the pretty idiot. Salantha, darling, I've got just the destination for your next Pretty Idiot's Guide. My business agent only sounds that chirpy when she's found some new way to try to get me killed. I'd like to think it's because the more trouble I get into, the better the resulting books turn out. That, or she still hasn't forgiven me for that topless dance I did at the Publishers Guild dinner party she took me to. In my defense, they provided the liquor. I just happened to drink a lot of it. Also in my defense, my topless dancing is godlike. Not back to the Tark Imperium, I hope. They said they'd shoot me if they ever caught me inside their borders again. My agent clucked at me. They said no such thing. They just heavily implied it. And that was only because you wrote that they were a bunch of pointlessly brutal totalitarian fuckwads. I snorted. That's right. And it was the fuckwad part that they objected to. Nobody likes being called a fuckwad, Salantha. Fuckwads least of all. But, no, I'm thinking we send you to write about a human planet this time. Humans. Interesting. The few I've known, I've mostly liked. Well, I don't hate them, anyway. And they look kind of like us Felra, at least a little bit. If you took a Felra and eliminated everything behind her forelegs, and kept her from dying from lack of some important organs, obviously, you would have something that still doesn't look particularly like a human. So, dye her green skin an earthier color, replace her beautiful tresses of feathery branching tvan with coarser, single-stranded hair, remove one pair of breasts, and take a digit from each hand. She still doesn't look quite human. Make her face a bit rounder and flatter, thicken her bone structure, and congratulations. You've surgically converted a Felra into something that could possibly maybe pass for a human in really poor lighting. Also, you're a sick fuck for doing such a thing. Point being, humans are sufficiently similar enough to us that they can be cute, in a goofy bipedal sort of way. And immersing yourself in an alien culture can be more rewarding if you can also immerse yourself in some attractive alien nookie along the way. Any aspiring travel writers who are reading this can consider that a pro tip from the Pretty Idiot. So, any particular human world? Somewhere with casinos, maybe? Or some place run by the Church of giving money, liquor, and carnal pleasure to sexy alien visitors? That last bit caught my agent off guard. Is that an actual religion? If it was, do you think I'd still be working? Of course you would. You love travel, trouble, and remunerated smartassery too much to just quit. Ah, I'm such a lucky Felra. Most agents charge extra for that kind of quality banter. The place I've got in mind for you is Ruggan, a frontier-level colony world well off the outer fringe of the arm. The tail tip of nowhere, in other words. And what's the attraction for a pretty idiot to play tourist there? Societal collapse. Rampaging Felra-eating predators. Pandemic-level clown outbreak. How about the longest-running ongoing war in the known galaxy? 287 common years and no end in sight. Yow. I'm passingly familiar with war, having wandered through 5 or 6 of varying size and awfulness while sightseeing, and writing about said sightseeing, and 3 centuries is a lot of war, especially confined to one planet. I could only imagine how that could twist and scar a world and its people. The devastation. The tragedy of wasted lives and resources. The sheer dysfunctionality of societies raised for generation after generation on bitter vengeance and the never-ending march towards victory and a peace they can no longer even properly conceptualize. A world of bloodlust, paranoia, and the threat of sudden brutal death staining every moment of every day. Why, the possibilities for misery were endless. It sounded perfect for a vacation getaway. I took regular commercial liners as far as Thielbera, but had to buy passage from there to Ruggen on an independent freighter that was slightly more reputable than a spaceport prostitute, just not as hygienic. There were only 3 other passengers headed to my destination, including a Crevan botanical researcher who ignored everybody and a not very sober Zarg who worked for one of the big interstellar communications providers and who must have fucked up his job just badly enough to get sent to an isolated hole-in-the-void posting, but not quite badly enough to be fired. I ended up sharing a cabin with the only other quadruped, an adorably optimistic Iratrian missionary who was going to Ruggen to set up a temple to the harmonious gods and try to get a congregation going. Being the cynical agnostic wretch that I am, I just had to ask how much demand she thought there would be for a doctrine of cooperative religious pacifism in the middle of a war zone. You offer food to the starving, not to those with bellies already full, she told me. Our beliefs are meant to be applied in the world, not just agreed with in the temple. And did she expect to end the war all by herself? I hope to make a difference to someone. Whether it's by teaching the way, by being an example, or just by offering a person who needs it a roof, a meal, and a sympathetic ear. If even one person considers their life to be better for having known me, my mission will be worthwhile. Damn. I had been entertaining myself with the idea of flirting mercilessly with her for the whole trip, but all that earnestness. All that simple, undeniable goodness. Even my cynicism and libido combined couldn't look that in the face. So I flirted with the ship's captain, instead. Not that there was any real challenge in it, as despite Felra not being 4-armed lizard people, Jixavan males are completely enamored of our tails, which are both more voluptuous and generally more exposed than those of their own females. Pro tip from the pretty idiot: if you're a Felra and need to manipulate a Jixavan guy, buy one of those tail stockings their women wear. Even the biggest ones will be too tight and short for you, so cut a bunch of slashes in it and pull it as far up your tail as it will go. Then wear a skirt short enough to expose the top hem of the tail stocking and enjoy your newfound powers of persuasion. I ended up getting 20% off my fare and 3 marriage proposals. Captain Akathan had made a few runs to Ruggen before, so I was able to ask him some questions about the place. If you've never read one of my Pretty Idiots guides before, part of my shtick, if you will, is lack of prior research regarding the places I go. My self-imposed limitation is that I can only obtain information by seeing for myself or asking someone with first-hand experience. No encyclopedias or hyperweb research. That media stuff is, at best, quarter-truths and agenda-driven grazer shit, anyway. By going into a place without knowledge of it, I go with fewer preconceptions. That's the idiot part of the title. The pretty part is because I am. And if you have to face life as an idiot, it really does help to be a pretty one. The good captain had never actually made planetfall on Ruggen, always conducting business from orbit. Sensible. Boring, but sensible. I therefore confined my inquiries to spacers matters. Like, were we going to have any issues with pirates or paramilitaries on our way in system? No pirates. Not enough shipping in or out for those guys to make a living raiding it, and too far from any active lanes to make a useful base. Pirates operating across star systems have to really watch their fuel expenditures. Captain Akathan then proceeded to give a suspiciously well-considered dissertation on how to turn a profit in space piracy, which I will not share here but have filed away for future reference should too many of my books bomb on the market. And as for paramilitary ships affiliated with the warring factions, I've never seen any. What about orbital defenses? Would there be minefields to be tensely navigated? Would we be subject to stop-and search by military patrol craft? Ruggan's a frontier-level system. The captain looked at me like I was a moron, albeit a moron with an incredibly sexy and distracting tale. There ain't even a transshipment station, just a few cheapo weather and comm satellites. I just put the ship in a parking orbit and they send shuttles up. But it's not like the shipments are ever so big you'd need an orbital dock anyway, and shuttles are fine for passengers. Of course, that also means no orbital repair yard and no fuel depot, but that's not much worry since Ruggan is just a long detour off our Thielbera-Rialto route and I always do a refuel and refit at Thielbera for safety's sake and, will you marry me? The shuttle ride down was as uneventful as such things generally are and afforded a chance to take in the view of Ruggan from medium-high orbit. It was not a particularly exciting planet seen from 18,000 miles above its equator under the sparse clouds, some smallish seas, broad smears of iron red in the right places to be deserts, accented by patches and streamers of an odd green that was almost an indecisive blue, and some blink-and-you'd-miss-them polar caps. But the thing is, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference how many planets you've seen out the porthole, or how much of an undifferentiated dirtball the one below you is. There is no such thing as ordinary when it comes to the sight of a whole damn world suspended in space right in front of you. It's a moment of magic every single time, and anybody who says otherwise is lying, or is a soulless shithead. Or, since those aren't mutually exclusive, they could be both, like a corporate journalist or a ribothy. I used the flight time to mentally review what first-hand knowledge of humans I possessed. Pro tip/caveat, members of a species often behave very differently in their own polities than they do in foreign or more cosmopolitan settings. Expatriates or visitors to your world are typically trying to get along in your society and tend to adjust their behavior accordingly. Their behavior when they are in the majority and they get to decide what's normal may be radically different. That said, there were a few truths I felt comfortable in ascribing to humans in general based on experience. For starters, sexual dimorphism. Humans born biologically male or female remain that sex, unless medically altered. Females are usually smaller and are the ones with slightly inadequate breasts. Males tend to be bigger, stronger, and coarser looking and, like most mammaloid males, have completely inadequate breasts. This dimorphism leads to the most basic social structures being built around male-female pairings and their offspring, family rather than the looser pack-based structure of Felra. These family structures appear to have a relationship similar to, though vastly more complicated than, the Felra mother-daughter bond. Basically, if you wrong a human, you may face retribution not just from her, but from her entire bloodline. Except sometimes you won't, because, like I said, complicated. Second, though many galactics tend to use the terms human and Terran as synonyms, humans emphatically do not. Among humans, the word Terran refers specifically to an inhabitant of the Terran Commonwealth, the oldest, largest, and apparently most detested human stellar nation. Humans who are not Commonwealth natives tend to have negative reactions to being called Terrans. In this context, the term negative reactions seems to cover a range from cold and profane verbal correction to assault with a power nailer. Maybe this trip would offer a chance to find out why that might be. I'd also been told that actual Terrans react poorly to being called human, though I've never met any Commonwealth Terrans and can't say for sure if that's true. Third, humans tend to be territorial, and therefore possessive. They have a strong impulse to guard things they have laid claim to. Don't try to make use of anything a human regards as their own without asking permission first, even if you intend to give it right back. This impulse extends quite strongly to their romantic or sexual partners as well, and attempting to bed, or even flirt with, a human who has been claimed by another will tend to be met with hostility. You could try asking for permission, I guess, but that just seems to lead to socially awkward hostility. And if you don't know why socially awkward hostility is worse than the regular kind, then obviously you've never been in a fistfight with a drunken dahu who was sporting a clingy wet kilt and a massive erection. The shuttle port was almost disappointingly ordinary. Just a cluster of prefab buildings alongside a huge concrete pad in a patch of rust-colored desert. The closest town was nearly over the horizon, inconvenient for travelers, but probably safer. Shuttle accidents can be ugly in populated areas. A few hover cars and some wheeled ground trucks of unfamiliar make sat off to one side, none obviously armed. No flags or other overt national insignia on them, which was a bit odd. Didn't see a fence. When in a place where people make a habit of shooting each other, the last thing you want to do is draw too much attention or be too glaringly civilian. Civilian too easily translates into helpless, which too easily transitions into victim. I tried to keep my bearing and appearance sort of generically military-ish, with my tresses tied back like we were taught during my militia service and trying to keep that "I have sticks shoved up all my fun holes" posture we used when the officers were looking. My blouse was subdued, professional, and buttoned up further than normal, my skirt longish and not slitted too much. Boots were tough, practical, and low, despite how awesome my hind calves look in high heels. Pro tip: if you want to do tourism the pretty idiot way, never wear any shoes you can't run for your life in. I wished I'd thought to bring a hat. They look kind of stupid and mess up most dress styles, but human militant types seem to have a thing for them, at least if 3V movies are anything to judge by. On the other end, since humans don't have tails, I figured they wouldn't have any issues with mine being uncovered, so I just left it bare, like normal. Besides, the only covering I had was the tail stocking I'd worn for the Jixivans, and that thing was slutty looking by any culture standards. Worst case, if the Rugenites Rugenese? Rugenians? Rugenakarbakers? Anyway, if the Rugen humans had problems with a naked tail, I could just keep it tucked under my skirt. Annoying, but doable. As it turned out, I was overdressed. The humans waiting for our little party to disembark were all dressed in light casuals, appropriate enough in the warm desert air. The closest thing to a uniform was the logoed name tag on a technician shirt that the human who was meeting the Zard Telecom guy had on. A couple of humans had a discreet bulge here or there that might mean a concealed handgun, but nobody was openly armed. Human faces are similar enough to ours to make their expressions pretty readable, and everybody looked at least mostly welcoming. Especially when they happened to be looking at my chest. Pro tip: where Jixivans get hopelessly turned on by our tails, mammaloids such as humans, Tarkich, and Dahu tend to fixate on our breasts. With humans and Dahu, I think it's mainly because, our boobs' other aesthetic qualities aside, we have twice as many as their own women, so if two are good, four are that much better. The upshot is that, when used in the proper context by a crafty felra, a swooping neckline can function as a magic "be my friend" button. Wear a halter top, and you could probably skate from a murder charge. In case you still haven't realized, being a felra is basically playing Galactic Life in easy mode. I was staring around like an idiot, albeit a pretty one, trying to figure out where I was supposed to go from the landing pad, when I heard somebody calling for me in accented galactophonic. Enter Nate Bob Ryder, my official government escort and translator that I didn't know I was getting. Nate Bob was a young male human, cute enough in a dirt-colored bipedal introvert trying to be outgoing sort of way. Tremendously fun to tease, I would later find out. Official government escort? I repeated, a bit on guard. I had no idea I rated such an honor. I also had no idea which government was planning on escorting me, or where, or why, but I wasn't telling him that yet. Pro tip: if you're touristing the pretty idiot way, always act like you know far more than you actually do. Ah, well, you're the first interstellar celebrity to ever visit the Rugen Republic, so... Celebrity? I'd never been called that before. I'd always assumed I didn't qualify as one, having too many IQ points and an inadequate drug habit. It turned out that Nate Bob had actually read a couple of my books before, making him a member of that special, select elite that gets the privilege of helping pay my rent. I'm with the Commerce Department, and when I saw your name on the incoming passenger manifest, I just had to come meet you. I loved your book on the Tark Imperium, How to Party Your Way Through a One-Party State. Did you really escape from a secret police center by pretending to be a topless interrogation consultant? Yes. Yes, I did. It was one of those moments in my life that I'm both not proud of, but also, kind of proud of. Tarkic state security goons are ruthless, brutal, and fanatical, yet almost endearingly naive in some respects. I was pretty sure the guys I pulled that stunt on were all purged afterwards, which I would have felt a little bad about, if not for the ruthless, brutal, fanatical part. So, it was nice having someone along who was both cute and a bit of a fanboy, but my paranoia was pricking up its ears and staring hard at Nate Bob. Pro tip: your paranoia exists for a reason, listen to it. Just what was his role intended to be? Minder? Bodyguard? Tour guide? Assassin? Governments had attached all of those to your shapely correspondent at various times during her visits. I probed this a little bit as Nate Bob escorted me to the arrival terminal. I'm mostly here to be a translator for you, he explained. Not many people in the Republic speak Galactophonic and you probably don't know Copernican English. And I know from your books that you don't have a neural implant to upload direct mental translations. Damn right I don't, and won't. Anything that can communicate to the hyperweb can be hacked. And I'm not just talking about some juvenile prankster making you say, fuckface, when you meant to say, honored sir. Governments can and do use backdoors into those neural links, and not just the obvious culprits like the Tark Imperium. I know another author who wrote some pretty unflattering things about the dominant political party on a certain nominally democratic planet she was visiting. She had a rather suspicious stroke, after which she could no longer think or say certain words or phrases. For instance, if you write the words, tyranny of the majority, she'll read that back to you as, glory of enlightened consensus. And she had a neural implant. So, pro tip, implants are very convenient for translation, for rapid information access, and for getting your higher cognitive functions treated like an open orifice at a Venjari orgy. I do keep a wrist-top holocom, so I punched up Copernican English on its translation function. Interestingly, it was listed as a nearly extinct dialect. If you want to cross over into the duchy, you'll need a translator from their side. They speak Espanglo over there. I'm not all that fluent in it, plus it's hard for a civil servant to get a border pass this close to the end of a ceasefire. Now that sounded all kinds of interesting, but before I could quiz Nate Bob on details, we were at the customs and immigration counter. There were the usual bioscans, followed by the usual questions, helpfully translated by Nate Bob. Nationality? Ports visited in the last 60 days. Any potentially invasive organics to declare? Any weapons? All done with smiling professionalism by a cute little older lady, while a couple of younger clerks watched and tried not to be too obvious about imagining what I look like naked. Then she got to the question about profession and reason for visit. Author, I told them through Nate Bob. I'm interested in writing about your country. The smile disappeared. The affably horny clerks went from looking like they were wanting to see me without clothes to wanting to see me without a head. The older lady snarled a word that set Nate Bob hastening into some sort of explanation. I quickly consulted my wrist top to see what that word was. Journalist. Eek. This wasn't the first time this had happened. So-called news reporters here in this galactic arm pretty much fall into two categories these days: blatant propagandists who work for state-run media and will tell any stupid, shameless lie as long as it helps prop up their governments, and traitorous whores who work for private media companies which have been bought up and thoroughly suborned by the galactic core worlds and will tell any stupid, shameless lie as long as it helps undermine their society. Journalists are held in about the same regard as infected vermin by most galactics outside the core. Nate Bob, tell them I'm not a journalist, I'm a real writer. He rattled off something in the local lingo, but the hard looks didn't go away. The cute older lady barked out what sounded like a question, prompting Nate Bob to turn back to me. They, want to know what the difference is. How to properly, yet concisely, explain the very real difference between writing in good faith to inform and entertain an audience versus peddling lies, spin, and character assassination in pursuit of agendas hostile to the reader's own interests. A tough one, but I do get paid for being better than average with words. Tell them that the difference between what I do and what modern journalists do is like the difference between sex and sexual assault. In my life, I've found that the best way to do something potentially uncomfortable is to just go straight ahead and get it over with as quickly as possible. If you need to remove a sticky bandage, just rip that sucker right off. Bath water too cold? Just jump right in, no point in dragging it out. Sex act you've never done before? Just stick it on in there and go to work. Got a really stupid question to ask? Just blurt it out and get to idioting. So, Nate Bob. About this war of yours. We were sitting in a little cafe that he had recommended, refreshing ourselves after defusing tensions with the shuttleport staff. As was appropriate for a government employee in the middle of his workday, Nate Bob was drinking some sort of mildly stimulating tea. As was appropriate for a professional author in the middle of her workday, I was drinking hard liquor. Oh, yeah. I guess you'll be wanting to see the war, huh? Well, the ceasefire doesn't end for 3 more days, but there should be a few battles to choose from. I suggest the Sandyvale River border clash. It's usually pretty destructive and not too far away. Lots of artillery at that one. Although, if you really wanted excitement, you should have come earlier this year. The Duchy's spring offensive was really something to see this last time. I looked around. We were in that town I'd seen in the distance from the shuttleport, Lake Grace, some sort of district capital. It was a fairly typical frontier world settlement, with a few distinct human touches about the architecture. Otherwise, good old frontier simplicity, with buildings tending to spread outward rather than upwards. What caught my attention was what I didn't see. No obvious shelters or defense installations. No anti-aerospace batteries. No patrols other than what looked to be civilian law enforcement. No damage other than some vandalism and general wear and tear. There were no signs at all of a nation at war. So, this war, I said carefully. Maybe you could, tell me about it. Nate Bob just kind of shrugged. A little, I guess. I mean, I haven't really participated since I was a kid. My 9th grade class built a drone for the big air battle over Cindertown and I got to fly it for a few minutes. That was pretty cool. No, I mean maybe you could tell me things like who's fighting this war and why. That sort of thing. He just stared at me for a moment, then gave himself a little, bap on the forehead. Right, I somehow forgot. You're the pretty idiot. You didn't do any research at all before coming here, did you? Of course not. I like to think of it as offering helpful guidance for someone who, say, gets knocked on the brain case and wakes up en route to a world they've never been on before. That's the point of my whole, learn everything from scratch with no outside help, shtick. Right. A realization seemed to have hit Nate Bob. I didn't mess up your process by coming to meet you, did I? I rippled my tail, which means much the same as a human shrug of the shoulders. You shortcut the process a little. But, I'm not one to complain about less work. In addition to being known as a pretty idiot, I'm also known to be pretty lazy. At least they still call you pretty, right? His face went red as he said this and he stumbled over the word pretty. It was absolutely adorable. Do you really think so? I asked, fluttering my eyes. If I hadn't been wearing boots, I would have run a toe along his ankle just to see what happened. Even without that, he still squirmed and had to find other things to look at. Right, yes, the war, he stammered. You'll want a history lesson, I guess. Let me, call some people. Dr. Sakurajin Skipworth taught classes at the local minor college and was part-time curator at a small museum on the other side of Lake Grace, the city, not the lake said city was named for. A human of early middle age, she had a slightly aloof, supercilious air that was almost felra in nature. In fact, she put me in mind of my business agent, to the point that flirting with her would feel super awkward. Dr. Skipworth was the local authority on Reginian history and had agreed to meet with me at her museum that evening to bring me up to speed. She also spoke pretty good galactophonic, which gave me the opportunity to conduct a little test on dear Nabob. Since his translation services would not be required, I gave him the errand of getting me a hotel room and seeing to what little luggage I'd brought along. If he were a government minder from a security or intelligence bureau intended to keep me in line, he would likely find some reason he should stay with me instead. But he went readily enough. The museum was, again, typical of such frontier worlds. Smallish, tidy, with a few artifacts from the old homeworld, lots of holos of the city's founders and early days, that sort of thing. Surprisingly few weapons and none of the memorials to fallen locals that you would expect in a conflict zone. It was actually a kind of blandly cheery little place, like a waiting room at the Department of Mild Amusement. It made a nice counterpoint to the rather grim story that Dr. Skipworth proceeded to lay out for me in her dry, slightly acerbic way. The first thing that had to be established was, what did I know of human history? The answer was, about as much as I know about chastity, which is to say that my exposure to the subject was scant and mostly involuntary. With a sigh that definitely reminded me of my business agent, the good doctor began her story way back at the human cradle world, Terra. The typical way for civilizations to expand once they have achieved interstellar travel is to send out well-supported expeditions composed of highly trained specialists to establish bases on promising worlds and begin making them ready to receive the ambitious and highly motivated settlers who will be sent after them. The Terrans didn't do that. At about the time they discovered faster-than-light technology, the Terran Commonwealth was in possession of certain ethnic groups that it had been trying to rid itself of for some time. Sensing an opportunity, the government rounded up as many of these people as they could catch and packed them aboard one-way colony ships, gave them some rudimentary terraforming gear, and kicked them off the planet. Thus, the first colonies the humans set up were not so much centers of scientific research and discovery as they were refugee camps. Yet somehow, the humans didn't die. Or rather, they didn't die out. Lots of individual humans died in really awful ways, but the colonies themselves survived and, eventually, began to thrive. They developed new civilizations of their own, new nations, and as they tamed their worlds and made them cradles of human life, they began to establish colonies of their own. Which was what the Terrans were waiting for. Once a colony world reached the stage of being able to establish its own new colonies, the Terrans saw that world as free real estate. They would sweep in and conquer the place, exterminate the now superfluous population after ensuring that enough escaped to make the next generation colonies viable, and then resettle the planet with their own people. Lather, rinse, repeat. It was an almost brilliantly despicable system. Of course, like any system, it broke down sometimes. The extermination campaigns brought opprobrium and occasional sanctions from other star nations. Then one campaign dragged on too long in a hopeless guerrilla war and, as hopeless wars tend to do, attracted a Venjari crusade to the losing side. The Terrans actually managed to defeat everyone's favorite enormous, four-armed, regenerating berserkers, so respect to them for being one of the few star nations to ever claim victory over a crusade. If you want to call having the guts ripped out of your military and 2 life-bearing planets completely ruined in exchange for wiping out a couple of million colonists and 24 Venjari a victory. This gave the colonies enough respite to build defenses and alliances, and the reclamation operations, as the Terrans called them, became far more difficult and infrequent after that. The process finally came to a complete stop about 150 years ago, when the Terrans attacked a colony that had applied for annexation to the United Jixavan Republic. The UJR takes defense of its citizens very seriously, and the Terrans learned the hard way that going toe-to-toe with one of the arm's major powers is a far cry from wiping out ramshackle colonial militias and massacring desperate civilians. In technical military terms, the Jishis put their boots so far up the Terran Commonwealth's ass that their meals still taste like shoe leather a century and a half later. So, where does Ruggin enter into all this? It starts with the founding of one of those second-generation colonies, Copernica. Copernica grew and flourished during that time when the Terrans were still recovering from the fight against the Crusaders. They became a somewhat important regional nation, spanning 3 mineral-rich systems and beginning to settle a 4th. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of Copernica if it was so important, it's because it would end up being the target of the next reclamation operation once the Terrans had recovered. Before that happened, though, the Copernicans had set their sights on a promising out-of-the-way planet they named Ruggin. Not very resource-rich, but it would require minimal environmental alteration to support human life and was far enough from Copernica proper to make a useful bolt hole for the Copernican people if the worst came to pass. Unfortunately, another of those second-gen colony worlds also had their eye on Ruggin, the Kingdom of Rialto, known today as the Rialto Hereditary Republic. Ruggin had been declared a duchy of the kingdom and one of His Majesty's brothers assigned to rule it, although there is no evidence that the first and only Duke of Ruggin ever actually set foot there. Rialto was nearer to Ruggin, a little larger, and a little richer. But the Copernicans had a head start on settling the place. The Rialtes managed to get a solid claim to about a third of the planet. Now, one would think that, with the threat of Terran invasion hanging over their heads, that Copernica and Rialto would find some sort of mutually acceptable compromise to share the planet so that they could save their strength for use against a common enemy. One would think that, unless one knows anything of humans and their history. Which I unfortunately now did, and said history seems best summarized by the phrase, and then things got worse. So, naturally, Copernica and Rialto went to war. 287 years ago. On Ruggin itself, the Copernicans did well and slowly but steadily took ground from the Rialtes. In space, Rialto's larger fleet began to get the upper hand over the Copernicans, who had to shift more and more of their forces to keep them out of the home systems. And then things got worse. 3 years into their little war, the Terrans announced their return by hitting Copernica like the fist of a genocidal god. Nanite plagues did most of the work, then the troops went in. The Terrans were set on ending things quickly, before they had to risk facing another crusade. Out of 74 million people, fewer than 500,000 escaped from the Copernican home systems to Ruggin. Okay. I was starting to get why non-Commonwealth humans reach for the power nailer if you call them Terrans. The fall of Copernica finally prompted the other human nations to get their shit together. The king of Rialto was overthrown and replaced by the more sensible, marginally more representative Hereditary Republic. They then combined forces with other human states like Amaterasu, Jericho, and Dakota and launched a counterstrike. With financial and technological support from some of their appalled Xeno neighbors, notably the Kraga Triunity and the Dahu Principalities of Rhea, they were able to cripple the Terran Reclamation Force and drive them from 2 of the 3 systems that had been Copernica. The Terrans sulked away and turned their attention to more profitable regions. Meanwhile, on Ruggin, things got strange. Or stupid, take your pick. When the Rialtes monarchy was overthrown, their forces on Ruggin remained loyal to the king and, even more so, their duke. The new Hereditary Republic government ordered them to make peace with the Copernican colonists, even if it meant surrender, not needing the distraction of a border war over a marginally useful planet while facing extinction at the hands of the Terrans. The monarchist troops ignored that order as illegal, since they would only accept commands from the rightful king of Rialto or Duke of Ruggin. The Rialto government refused to accept that either of those individuals, both of whom were now wards of Rialto's penal system, had any legal right to give such orders. The monarchists refused to accept that the new government had any right to tell them who their liege was or wasn't. The monarchists were willing to fight over the issue. The Hereditary Republic wasn't, having too much other shit going on to care very much, so they just cut the colony loose altogether. On the Copernican side of Ruggan, they were in shock from the sudden loss of their home nation and the strain of absorbing the panicked refugees flowing in. They called for a truce and asked the colonists in the duchy about negotiating an end to their war. In a move that should surprise no one who has been paying attention, the duchy's ranking general replied that he had no authority to negotiate a settlement, only the reigning duke had that right. As a local commander, he had been authorized by his liege to arrange ceasefires of up to 90 days, or to accept unconditional surrender of hostile forces. Nothing else. Would the Copernicans like to surrender? This is the point where nearly any other galactics would have done the same, sensible, pragmatic thing. Seeing that their home nation was destroyed and their best hope of survival lay in banding together with former enemies who were really in no position to dominate them in any meaningful way anyhow, reasonable people would have gone through the motions of a symbolic, pro forma surrender and gone on about their lives. So, being humans, the Copernican colonists naturally did the opposite of that and said, "Fuck you and your duke. We're not giving up and losing a war that we were winning." They did agree to a 90-day suspension of hostilities though. And at the end of that 90 days, the Duchy of Ruggan and the Copernican Republic of Ruggan both realized that peace was better, the war was idiotic, and they put aside their differences. Just kidding. As soon as the 90 days were up, fighting flared up all along the border until a new ceasefire was arranged a couple of days later. And the same thing happened 90 days after that. And 90 days after that. And you've seriously been doing this for almost 3 fucking centuries? I asked Dr. Skipworth. Yes. With varying levels of enthusiasm over time, but yes. Every 90 days, the Republic and the Duchy go to war. Wow. They hate each other that much? Dr. Skipworth looked puzzled. Normally I would comment on how it made her look cute or something equally flirtatious, but the lesson in human history had put a damper on even my libido. Hate? She asked. We don't hate each other. My brother-in-law is from the Duchy. They're more or less just like us, except they speak a Spanglo and are mostly Catholics. So, why fight a war at all? Because we're both it. We're all that's left of our sides. If we surrender to the Duchy, the last surviving piece of Copernica ceases to exist. And if the Duchy surrenders to us, or even betrays their duke's last commands by negotiating a settlement without his permission, then their loyalty to him has meant nothing and they are not the people they claim to be. If the war ends with anything other than our surrender, the Duchy can no longer legitimately be the Duchy. And will never surrender. So the status quo remains. There was another possible ending. The Republic was bigger and stronger. Why couldn't they conquer the Duchy and force them to give up? Dr. Skipworth looked at me like I'd just asked her to fuck a farm animal while I watched. They won't surrender without orders from a Duke of the Romero dynasty, and they don't have one. They'd fight us to the bitter end and we would have to kill millions of people who have done nothing to deserve it. And if we did that, we should just change our name to the goddamn Terran Commonwealth and be done with it. Nate Bob had found me a room at a hotel that was probably pretty swanky by local standards but would be about a 3 out of 5 on a more developed planet. It was nicer than the places I normally stay, though, and clean. It was also the only one in the area equipped for Xeno visitors. That's not something you realize is a big deal until you have to take a shit on a planet where the plumbing is designed for people with half as many legs as you. That said, I made up a reason to refuse the room and swap for one on another floor. I still didn't trust that Nate Bob wasn't playing spy games with me, so that was a precaution in case he'd had the room bugged or some such. He didn't make a fuss about swapping, though, so maybe I was just being overly cautious. Supper was lovely, if uncomplicated. Only a few things on the native menu were actively poisonous to a Felra, with about half of the remainder simply indigestible or non-nutritive for me. I made sure to get my food order picked out before I did any serious drinking. Pro tip from the pretty idiot: the drunker you get, the more certain you will become that your gut can handle the more exotic local delicacies. It most likely can't. Eat before drinking to excess, or risk blowing your meal out either or both ends. So, Nate Bob, I was wondering, are you still on the clock? He cocked his head at me like a pet blurreth, just bigger and humaner. What I mean is, are we having supper together as part of your official duties, or is this purely social? I'm on salary, so I don't really have set hours. I just thought I should make myself available for as long as you need me. Why? I rippled my tail and gave him my aren't you so sweet smile. I was just trying to figure out if this should be considered a business meeting, or a first date. He was a stammering wreck for a little while after that, which became even more endearing after the booze started hitting me hard. Both good things. Frankly, after that history lesson, I needed a good buzz and a round of half-serious coquetry to get my groove back. The next 2 days were a whirl of day trips to various places. Nate Bob kept suggesting all kinds of cultural sites, museums, monuments, that sort of thing. But I shot most of those suggestions down. You learn much more about a society and its functioning, and dysfunctioning, and character by going to where the normal people go about their normal lives. Where and how do they get food or other necessities? How do they travel? Where do they live? Where do they work? What do they do aside from work? That's all much more interesting to me than looking at a 300-foot concrete image of that culture's personification of virtue. Unless that personification is naked, which a surprising number are. Then, yeah, the sight of a cement nipple 8 feet across can be worth the trip. But, really, the answer to most of those questions was, about like anyone else. We went to a human food market, a franchise store of a planet-wide chain. Yes, the company apparently had stores over in the Duchy, too. The Rugenians have food synthers, but like all sensible sapients, they realize that synth food is to real food what masturbation is to sex, an inferior substitute that loses much of its appeal once you've had the real thing. It gets the job done, but it's not something you'd ever boast about. There were quite a few things in the food market I could safely try, and I did sample a few. The main things I noted, though, were the variety and quantity of food available and the lack of a rationing system. Anyone could walk in and purchase as much as they wanted of whatever they wanted. That may not sound like anything special, but such facts reveal a lot about the condition of a nation's economy and politics. There were no lines to get in the door. There was no identity verification or proof of party membership before goods could be obtained. I saw no obvious shortages. People from across the social and economic spectrum all shopped at the same store. Prices were in the local currency rather than galactic standards, but once I figured out the exchange rate, they seemed reasonable enough. These can all be taken as evidence that a society is at least mostly functional and responsive to the needs of its members and that the government is not too evil. Or if it is, it's the smart kind of evil. We hit up a literature kiosk. Like most sensible people, the reading humans of the Rugged Republic are leery of downloading literature into hyperweb-connected devices. There is far too much of a tendency for governments, corporations, or other interested parties to make stealth edits to works that they deem too objectionable. The entire themes of certain books have been slowly changed over time to mean the opposite of what was originally intended. My own book on traveling through the 10 Sons corporatocracy, Debt Becomes Her, was subject to that. After the corporatocracy realized I wasn't much of a fan, copies of it on hyperweb-linked devices gradually evolved into something that sounded like it was written by one of the ruling megacorp's marketing departments, and it almost certainly was. Readers who are concerned about such tampering can either use non-communicating e-slates to store their books, which have to be loaded in via physical connection at a kiosk, or they can have a physical copy sent for them there. The literature kiosk we stopped at had a broad selection, if not quite up to date. Lots of contemporary human works, of course. Not that many ancient human classics available compared to most cultures, but Nate Bob explained that the Terran Commonwealth had purged the vast majority of pre-diaspora literature and the original colonists/exiles had been stripped of all such cultural trappings before being sent out. There was apparently a long-standing movement among the diaspora human populations to recover or reconstruct as many of these lost works as possible, but it was a slow, spotty process. The Rugenians, at least, did not appear to openly suppress any ideas or ideologies. There were books available from across the political spectrum, with no notable gaps. Same for religious expression. While there may have been a preponderance of works focusing on the most popular local faith, religions from across the galaxy were well represented. Even the Eretrian holy text Way of the Harmonious Gods showed to have been purchased quite a few times, so my friend the adorable missionary might not be having as hard a time as I had predicted for her. There was fiction, too, and I didn't see any particular genre dominating. The native literature was especially revealing. Not nearly as much gung-ho military-themed stuff as you would expect in a nation at war. Not nearly as much grim stuff as you would expect from a people with so depressing a history. Copernican descent humans struck me as an optimistic bunch. Although on reflection, I guess they'd have to be. With all the shit they've been through, the non-optimists probably all self-selected themselves out of the gene pool. The human fiction section covered a pretty broad range, going into several niches and subgenres that I had no idea even existed. Who even writes in the genre of shy human college girl meets ex-special forces trillionaire shape-shifting alpha felra sorceress contemporary romance? Also, who reads that? Humans do, and more of them than you would think, if the sales figures for Samantha's Sinful Spec Ops Centauride Shifter are anything to go by. Maybe I should diversify my writing. Maybe I should find some shy human college girls and do some, research. 2 of my own books were for sale there. After looking at the sales figures, maybe I shouldn't just joke about switching genres. Nate Bob invited me to attend a religious ceremony with his family one evening. I'm not a spiritual person myself, but I respect it as an important social element and a source of many cultures' moral and ethical beliefs. Still, I understand that some faiths can be touchy about non-initiates partaking in their rituals. If you've read Hitchhiking to Paradise, The Pretty Idiot's Guide to the Dahu Principalities of Berksu, you'll recall that I once faced having my fun holes invaded by very non-fun spiky hook things for having taken what I thought was a glass of punch off what I thought was a buffet table. Turned out, the buffet table was an altar and the punch was a special concoction set out for the participants in a ceremony and was made of rare sacred herbs that had been prayed over by 50 priests non-stop for a whole year. Tasted like crap and it didn't make me feel any holier going in or coming out, but I could understand why the locals were peeved at me. I still think that what they wanted to do to my ovaries as expiation was a bit much, though. Nate Bob told me not to worry about it, that the church he and his parents attended was always open to newcomers, as long as they behaved with some decorum. Basically just keep your mouth shut and clothes on, and you'd be fine. Contrary to what my business agent thinks, I can do both of those. I often don't, but I can. So I put on a pretty dress and we met Nate Bob's parents and little brother. For any fella reading this, that's like a littermate, but from a different litter, if that makes any sense, out front of their church. The parents seemed nice enough to make me a little jealous. Don't get me wrong, my mother is great, if a little prone to comments about wishing I'd not live up to my pretty idiot branding quite so well. But having 2 awesome mother equivalents just seems like it'd be a hoot. His brother Gabe Tom said about 4 words and stared at my breasts the whole time, which I could have had fun with if he weren't a little brother. As in, school-aged. The church and the service itself were both simple, sober affairs. The only adornment was a geometric figure that my wrist top informed me was an ancient human execution device. Ominous, but it didn't actually get used during the service. Mostly it was people listening to the leader of the ceremony talk about things and occasionally singing together. I didn't understand a word of the talking, since I wasn't going to hinder Nate Bob's participation by asking him to translate. The singing was pretty nice, if more enthusiastic than skilled. After the official worship stuff was all done, everyone socialized for a bit, which is one of those things common to pretty much every religion ever. Nate Bob introduced me to some mostly older humans who were either friends of his parents or some sort of relation. I still don't quite get how extended families work. I think one of them asked if I was his girlfriend, since he blushed really hard and refused to translate the question for me. If anyone talked about the war with the duchy, I didn't catch it, but a very old man asked if I was a Jixavan from the United Republic. He at least got the limb count and approximate color right. I gently informed him that, sorry, no, I was a Felra from the free city of Shalavlath. Ah, that's too bad, the very old man said after Nate Bob gave him my reply. He looked like I'd just told him his pet had run away. I always wanted to shake hands with a Jixavan. They're good people, they are. They kicked the shit out of those Terran fuckstains, you know. I gathered from the looks the very old man received that this was not the sort of language habitually used inside their temples. The very old man didn't seem to give a damn. I decided I liked him. Later, Nate Bob gave me a sort of broad outline of what their religion is about. As I understand it, and I may not, their creator set out some standards that humans were supposed to live by. Nothing too detailed, just basic things about not killing each other, not being dishonest assholes to each other, respecting the creator, that sort of thing. And if you were paying attention during the history lesson earlier, you should already know that the humans failed at pretty much all of that. So the creator turned part of himself into a human and came down to see what their problem was. This son of the creator tried to explain to people in a little more detail how humans could follow the creator's guidelines and maybe be better people to each other. So the humans killed him for that, because of course they did. But that somehow made the creator understand that the people he'd made simply couldn't help being gigantic fuck-ups and made him inclined to forgive them for it if they would just understand how they were disappointing him and feel regret about it. I'm pretty sure I screwed that explanation up, but that's how I remember it. I asked Nate Bob why his sect or whatever set themselves a standard of behavior that they believed they as humans couldn't actually meet. His answer was that he thought the attempt to reach those standards made them better people, even if they failed sometimes, or even if they failed a lot. I think it's better to have expectations for yourself that are higher than your reach and to fail to live up to them, than it is to have expectations that are beneath you and to consistently live down to them. Don't you? I don't know if Nate Bob meant for that comment to sting, but it did, a little. It was finally the big day. The day the ceasefire ended. War Day. The thing I had come here for. Yay. It's so wonderful to have an off-world military expert on hand, burbled Danny Seth Patel in slightly halting galactophonic as he shook my hand. Lieutenant Patel, I guess I should say. He was a thick, muscular guy with a huge mustache that looked like a poorly groomed pet napping on his lip. Maybe you could look over our defenses and tell me what you think. I sighed, but only internally. Nate Bob had called the commander of the Republic's forces at Sandyvale River and asked if I could have access. But, since one really does not want to risk being confused for a media hack around people who all have guns and digging equipment handy, he had introduced me as a foreign military observer. Which was not exactly a lie. I have observed a lot of foreign militaries in my life. I also did my mandatory stint in my city's defense forces, achieving the rank of junior gunnery assistant. In terms of rank structure, that put me about a half step above the crud we swabbed out of the cannon barrels. But compared to Lieutenant Patel, maybe I was an expert. At least I understood the concept of operational security. I'd be glad to have a look, I said, trying to be diplomatic. But are you sure it's wise to allow outsiders into your positions like that? Oh, it's fine. Lieutenant Patel waved that aside like he was clearing out a fart. The shooting won't start for a few hours yet. No. I mean, aren't you concerned about letting me see too much? Lieutenant Patel just blinked at me. Why? Everybody should have their clothes on. We do have a dress code. I mean, it isn't strict or anything, but everybody's junk should be covered up. I looked to see whether the lieutenant was wearing a sidearm before I responded. If you're about to risk insulting the intelligence of someone who can legally kill you, knowing how quickly they can resort to a lethal option is excellent information to have. You can consider that another pro tip, but it's really just common sense. Seeing that Lieutenant Patel didn't appear to have anything deadlier than a multi-tool on him at the moment, I went for broke and said, "What I mean is, how do you know I won't take the information I gather about your forces and give it to the Duchy?" I was about 5 seconds from just punching up operational security on my wrist-top's dictionary function and ordering it to translate that into Copernican English for him. The lieutenant's eyes widened as he considered that. Ooh. That would be a fun narrative, wouldn't it? Betrayed by an exotic foreign beauty who turns out to be an enemy spy. Defeated by our own welcoming nature. That would be tragic as fuck. Strangely enough, Patel seemed more excited than dismayed by that prospect. "Are you really going to tell the Duchy where our weak spots are? Call in ranging data, that sort of thing?" No. "Are you sure?" He held up his holocom. "I've got their battery commander on my contacts list. Maybe another time. I'm just here to observe the fighting, not participate in it." Too bad. That traitor thing would be a cool angle to work into the battle. But then he perked up again. "Oh, I know. We can get Corporal Fuller to do it. Everyone already thinks she's kind of an ass weasel." The lieutenant wound up detailing a soldier to take me and the ever-present Nate Bob on a tour of the defenses, which were apparently all down at the riverside a mile or so from the command post. Something I quickly noticed as we made our way there was that actual, uniformed soldiers like our guide were in the distinct minority. Maybe 1 person out of 10 or so, and usually in supervisory roles. The rest were all obviously civilians. And obviously not just because of how they were dressed, but how they carried themselves. There was a lot of slouching, lollygagging, and general grab-ass going on and not a lot of disciplined urgency. Not a lot of weapons, either. The occasional holstered sidearm was about it. "We spent all week getting the new defenses ready," our guide boasted as we reached the outlying rifle pits. "This will look so much cooler than last time. We scrounged enough lumber to build guard towers for this one." So they had. I wasn't sure why. Not many troops these days are suicidal enough to climb into the top of a big, fragile gunfire magnet just for the purpose of improving their field of view to almost 2% of what a drone that you could buy with pocket change could see. I mean, I'm no Yilidara the Conqueror, but I'm pretty sure wooden defensive towers went out of military use about the same time crossbows did. So did wooden palisades, of which I saw several. The rest of the defenses were more advanced, though. Early industrial age, at least. Lots of trenches and earthen redoubts, sandbagged fighting emplacements, the occasional dugout or blockhouse, that sort of thing. The whole construction straggled along the waterfront for about a half-mile, then just stopped. No outer works, perimeter defenses, or anything else, other than some high-visibility pennants on tall poles at each end. It was just kind of stuck out there. By itself. Guarding nothing in particular. A look across the river to the Duchy's side revealed a basically identical setup. "I notice you've dug weapon positions, but I don't see weapons in them," I said tactfully. "Oh, of course not. All the guns are upslope, in the safe zone." I cut a glance at Nate Bob, who seemed to not want me to see his expression as he translated this. We passed a dugout with a rope barricade around it. There was a large sign attached to it that, according to my wrist top, read "Magazine" in both Copernican English and Espanglo. The sign was helpfully facing the river. So, I asked our guide, "Why is there a magazine here, if the guns are, Oh, we just mixed up some bags of ANFO and stuck them in there." ANFO? I consulted my wrist top. It meant ammonium nitrate/fuel oil. A cheap, often improvised explosive made from fertilizer and distilled petroleum. Ah, got it. Now for the main question, why? The soldier shrugged. It just seemed like a cool thing to do. The artillery battery was located some distance away from the actual defenses, with the guns set up all in a row, right out in the open. Now, I may have only achieved the rank of cannon wiper back home, but the tactical soundness of this setup seemed questionable. The guns themselves, also sort of questionable. Artillery takes many forms on the modern battlefield. In my heady youthful days as a militia trooper, I was trained to work on orbital railguns, the huge, hypervelocity planetary defense weapons that throw kinetic slugs the size of public transit vehicles that do to starships approximately what a Thunderhoof bull's schlong does to his cows. I was also cross-trained on ground-based artillery, because you never know, and in the Shalavlath Defense Forces that meant missile launchers and self-propelled plasma mortars. What the Rugenians had brought to the field were not any of those things. No, in keeping, I suppose, with their general rugged do-it-yourself out-of-what-you-have frontier attitude, they had rolled out a dozen coilguns. If you don't know what those are, if you think of a much cruder version of a railgun, you'd be wrong. But not completely so. Somewhat related principles of operation, and all that. Coil guns use powerful sequential electromagnets to accelerate a projectile down their barrel and launch it in the direction of whatever has pissed you off. They have the advantages of being relatively cheap and simple to build compared to railguns or energy weapons, and they can launch just about anything that contains enough ferrous metal and will fit down their barrel. And that's about it. Coilguns' disadvantages are, basically everything else. They are short-ranged. They can only be scaled up so large before their inefficiency renders them pointless. Velocity is generally low, with the consequent need to lob projectiles at whatever you're trying to make unhappy. Accuracy is strictly meh. Aside from price and ease of manufacture, there is literally no reason to choose coil gun artillery over any other weapon system available. So of course the Rugenians had a bunch of them. They also had a rocket launcher. Note that I did not say missile launcher. Rocket launcher. Basically a pipe on a bipod with a trigger that would spit out unguided solid fuel rockets that were about the size of my forearm. It looked more like an oversized party favor than a weapon of war. Speaking of party favors, we found quite a crowd gathering by the time we got back to Lieutenant Patel's command post, a table and some lawn chairs under a portable canopy. There were humans of every description thronging the area, civilians of all ages and classes, family units with children. Almost no one was armed. Most were carrying small packs and maybe a rolled blanket. Here and there, vendors of junk food and overpriced beverages were trundling carts full of their wares down toward the riverside. I gave Nate Bob a hard look. "This battle always draws a big crowd," he said by way of explanation. "Like I told you, lots of artillery at this one." Patel nodded his agreement. "We could make a shitload charging admission. But, that would kind of spoil the whole patriotic vibe, I guess. We should keep this about upholding the nation's honor." "And blowing up the duchy," added another officer who was getting a beer out of the command post's fridge. "Yeah, and blowing up the duchy, of course. Filthy monarchist bastards, right?" Lieutenant Patel said that last phrase in the same tone you'd use for something like, mildly unattractive panties, right? Aha. I couldn't keep from heaving a big, full-body sigh as I looked around. "You know, I'm getting the idea that this battle of yours is not quite what it's billed to be." For the first time, Lieutenant Patel looked genuinely offended. "What do you mean by that?" "We're fixing to blast the crap out of those duchy asswipes. We're upholding our country's honor and traditions here. Maybe we don't do it the way you more cosmopolitan types do. And maybe we have a little fun with it. But I assure you, Miss Rivalfina, note, humans often mistakenly address Felra this way, using our matronym as a formal name, we are conducting a serious military operation here." And I might have been a little bit chastened by that, if he hadn't concluded his remarks by immediately gulping down a beer and a couple of cannabis cookies. The war kicked off around midday, when the lieutenant came on the public address system with the grim warning that a state of war now existed between the Copernican Republic of Ruggen and the Duchy of Ruggen, that all areas within 10 miles of the border were now considered a combat theater, and that any civilians remaining in the area did so strictly at their own risk. And I'm assuming that this was some kind of formal, perhaps ritualized announcement, because the hundreds if not thousands of spectators sitting along the riverside recited the warning from memory right along with him. Nate Bob and I were not among them, however. Nate Bob had obtained a nice checkered blanket and laid it out beside the coil gun battery. He said we would have a better view from up here, plus the gunners had their own porta-potty in case we needed it. He had also come up with some sort of greasy lump of a confection called a deep-fried bacon funnel cake, that I could eat and admittedly tasted all kinds of awesome, but was almost certainly going straight to my rear hips and tail. About 3 seconds after the announcement of hostilities, one of the coil guns beside us made a tooth-loosening VWEM and lobbed its payload across the river. Mud geysered up in front of the Dutchie's defenses as the shell missed by a good 20 yards. The crowd let out a groan and the other gun crews sent dirty looks at the one that had just fired. From the opposite riverbank the Dutchie's own guns vheemed out a reply, one shot landing in the water, the other blasting a shallow crater in one of the earthen ramparts. The battle was on. It was one of the strangest fights I'd ever seen, but just as entertaining as Nate Bob had promised. Both sides simply stood off and pounded the snot out of the enemy's elaborate and theatrical, but utterly unoccupied defenses, while hordes of spectators looked on from a safe distance. I quickly noticed that the gun crews were pacing themselves, firing in a slow, steady progression that served no particular military purpose, but gave the crowds a chance to observe and savor each salvo before the next one hit. A particularly well-placed shot would draw cheers, often from both sides of the river. The ducal troops had planted poles bearing their nation's blue and gold flag liberally throughout their positions, and the Republic crowd took great delight in their gunners picking these off. On the other hand, about an hour into the battle an enemy shell finally found the magazine bunker on our side and the thing went up with a ground-shaking roar that drew a standing ovation from all present. The ducal gunner who had made the shot acknowledged this with a grand bow in our direction, before being hoisted onto his fellows' shoulders and paraded around their battery. At one point a lull occurred when Lieutenant Patel called a ceasefire and sent a hover car across the river under a white flag. I thought that might signify the end of the battle, but as it turned out, he had noticed that one of the Dutchie's coil guns hadn't fired in a while and called the enemy battery commander to see what the problem was. They'd had a supercapacitor go bad, taking the gun out of commission. Patel had spares, so he sent them one. They sent back several bottles of something called neo-mezcal that looked and smelled like it would make a fine improvised incendiary, but which was received with great enthusiasm by the lieutenant and his staff. The shooting resumed as soon as these were handed out among the troops. I talked to some of the gun crews during the lull. Mostly young reservists in the Republic's standing army and not much more than school age, they pretty universally expressed delight at being able to blow shit up, a relatable feeling to most young sapients and a disdain for their ducal counterparts that seemed more ritualistic than heartfelt. They sounded as if they were discussing a sports rivalry rather than an enemy nation. Those guys can't shoot for shit. They want to rule the planet, but they don't even have a ruler of their own. Know why all the trees in this district lean toward the border? Because the Dutchie sucks. That sort of thing. The fighting, if you want to call it that, went on for about 4 hours altogether before reaching a climax where both sides suddenly went to continuous rapid fire, blasting the shit out of both riverbanks. Nate Bob later explained that it was because neither side's gunners wanted to transport and used ammunition back their depots, so they made sure to fire it all away before the end. At any rate, they churned each other's side of the river to muddy ruin in a final crescendo of pointless, casualty-free mayhem and then stopped. It was like the flicking of a switch. One moment, enough explosives lashing at ground and air to make it feel like this child's toy war was becoming the real thing, and then, silence. No more vheeming of coil guns, whooshing of rockets, or rumble of high explosives. Just a pitter-pattering of settling dust and debris for a couple of heartbeats and then a new rumble. Applause. Spectators, soldiers, vendors, and everybody. just coming to their feet and clapping and cheering as loud as they could. And into that, rather impotently, spoke the voice of Lieutenant Patel over the loudspeakers announcing that a new 90-day ceasefire was in place and peace was once again at hand. Across the river, I could just barely hear what I assumed was the Duchy's own version of the announcement, presumably in Espanglo. That's when the party really kicked into gear. The whole riverside became a study in movement. Some people got music going and began to dance, jerky and graceless compared to Felra dancing, but with a joy that was completely infectious. 5 or 6 competing sound systems were blaring out as many songs, creating a cacophony that might have been worse than the artillery. At least, until Lieutenant Patel solved the issue by using the public address system to blast out his own musical selections over top of all the others. Things were being thrown in the air. As the kids were ushered off, inhibitions were being thrown by the wayside. Tops were coming off liquor bottles, and off the women who were imbibing from those bottles. Hover cars were crisscrossing the water, bringing zesty grilled meats and equally zesty lads and lasses from the Duchy's side and sending back beer, sweets, and revelers from ours. I tried the neo-mezcal. I won't say I could safely drink it, because I'm not sure anyone can, humans included, but it wouldn't kill me anytime soon, would get me drunk, and started tasting better after the 6th or 7th shot. At some point, I got challenged to a drinking contest by a dark, stocky woman who I think was a gunnery sergeant from the ducal army. Things are a little blurry for a while after that. I remember winning. I mean, I'm a Felra, so I've got a lot more body mass. And I'm an author, so I've got a professional level tolerance for booze. I remember, vaguely, Nate Bob attempting to talk me out of various things, including failing to prevent me from demonstrating my renowned topless dancing prowess. Which I'm pretty sure is still godlike, if my memories of the masses adoring chants of Centaur Waifu are anything to go by. It gets even patchier after that, but the last memory that stands out is of being awkwardly assisted into Nate Bob's hover car by 3 or 4 nice humans who were in little better condition than myself, while Nate Bob himself gallantly tried to keep a blanket draped around my bare shoulders. After that, nothing. I met Nate Bob the next day over lunch in my hotel room. I'd slept right through breakfast and then puked right through brunch, but lunchtime saw me scrubbed and fresh-faced, wrapped in a comfortable dressing gown and ready to face the day as long as I didn't have to leave the room to do it. I never could find your blouse, he said as he toyed with something called a BLT that smelled great but I couldn't eat. Sorry. Well, thank you for trying. When you live the pretty idiot life, you learn not to get too attached to your clothes. I seem to be missing a bra, too. Oh, that. Nate Bob seemed to struggle with himself a little before calling up a hollow on his wrist top. It was a good picture, very dramatic. Amid the mud and char of war's devastation, a trio of flagpoles had been erected. They stood proud, defiant, the dawn light giving them little halos. On the left, the elaborate blue and gold emblem of the Duchy of Ruggen. On the right, the red-on-grey crossbars of the Copernican Republic of Ruggen. And in the center, waving just as proudly in the breeze, a familiar four-cupped brazier. This is making the rounds on the planetary web, Nate Bob explained, looking like he was trying not to say something else. You seem to have made an impression. Ah. I mulled that over a mouthful of shredded smoked meat. Is that impression the meaning behind the cryptic phrase, Centaur Waifu? I suppose it is. I pondered it all as I took a drink. Water, alas, because even a professional author can't be drunk all the time. You know, you could have told me at any point that this whole war of yours is just staged. No, ceremonial feels like a better word for what you guys do. Anyway, you could have said something. I thought you preferred learning things the hard way. This was said with a cheeky little grin that looked entirely too kissable. I sighed. There is that. Fine. I'll give you the point for that one. So, what did you think of it? You mean the so-called battle? Nate Bob waved with the hand that didn't have a BLT in it. I mean all of it. The whole situation. The whole planet, I guess. I should have taken the time to consider how to say things. Be tactful. Use my slightly above-average professional skill with words to put things in just the right way. But I didn't because I was a little hungover, I was more than a little horny, and I have a hard time remembering to give a shit what other people think of me. Because I'm the pretty idiot, in other words. It's kind of stupid, I said, going straight to the point. You guys exist in an utterly pointless state of perpetual war over some ultimately meaningless points of national pride that any other nations would have resolved through negotiations ages ago. On the other hand, you seem to realize how pointless it is, so instead of actually hurting each other, you use the war as a ritualized excuse to have fun blowing shit up and partying like lunatics every 3 months. I rippled my tail and did a human shrug along with it, so he'd get the point, and because it drew his eyes to my neckline. So, yeah, it's stupid, but I've seen a whole lot worse out there. Is that what you'll write about us in your book? I think the words I'll use will be something to the effect of, a stupid idea, but very well executed. Nate Bob pursed his lips, but nodded his agreement. Pithy. And not unfair. I gave him a cheeky look to match his own from earlier. Thanks. I totally stole that, though. From another author. From my mother. It's how she describes my entire career. We ate together in silence for a moment. Then, since I wasn't wearing boots this time, I did take the opportunity to run a toe up his ankle. His reaction was as priceless as I had hoped. Miss Salantha. You shouldn't, that is, we ought not, he got out before I silenced him with a finger to his lips. Less talking, Nate Bob. More doing. That seemed like the proper frontier world work ethic. Taking my own words to heart, I let the dressing gown start falling open off my shoulders. He tried, very admirably, to keep his eyes on my face. He failed. Badly. But it was a good effort, and the effort was what counted. You're leaving in a few days, he said, wetting his lips. Yes, I am. I ran my toe further up. And I'm here with you in an official capacity. Very true. I took one of his hands in mine. It's totally unprofessional for a public servant to. Unprofessional as fuck, I breathed as I leaned across the table. He met me partway, with a lovely little kiss. But then he backed away again. I just want to say, one last time, he said in a soft but very firm voice, that doing this is an absolutely stupid idea. We both know that, right? Of course it is. I drew his hand to my body. Absolute train wreck. But what have we just established about stupid ideas? He smiled at me, a nice guy smile, but with some hints of rascal in it. Just the kind I liked. That it's important to make sure their execution is done well. Just so, I said, stepping back and letting my dressing gown hit the floor. And for the next few hours, Nate Bob upheld the traditions of his country, his planet, and his species by executing our stupid idea very, very well indeed. Author's note, I hope everyone had fun with this one. The idea and style are based loosely off of the travel articles P.J. O'Rourke used to write back in the 80s, particularly Ship of Fools, about going on a tourist cruise in the Soviet Union. The working title for this one was War and Other Roadside Attractions, but I think that will be the title of Salantha's general overview of human space, instead.